The wind screamed across the white plain like a wounded animal, tearing at the world with icy claws. Snow did not fall so much as hurl itself sideways, devouring the horizon, erasing the lines between sky and earth. In that furious wilderness a woman staggered forward, her cloak pulled tight against her body, her steps erratic, her breath pluming in ragged bursts that the gale instantly stole away. Evelyn Carrington had once been accustomed to silks, to the warm hush of drawing rooms where chandeliers glittered above her head. Now, the only glitter was ice clinging to her lashes, the only hush the muffled silence of her own rejection ringing louder than the storm itself. The town had expelled her with eyes sharper than blades. Whispers followed her down every boardwalk. Widow, curse, too pretty to trust, too young to pity. When her husband died, the wealth of his family turned cold against her. She had been told to leave the house, to take nothing but the dress on her back. In her mind, the echo of slammed doors kept pace with her stumbling steps. She walked because she had nowhere else to fall, and the snow was as good a grave as any. Her boots sank into drifts that swallowed her ankles. Each step grew slower, heavier, until she no longer knew if she moved forward at all. Her face burned with cold, then numbed into a hollow absence. Still, she pressed on, though her body begged her to collapse. Shame drove her more than survival. Better to perish in white oblivion than crawl back to the town that had spat her out. She did not see the shape of the cabin through the blur of storm, not until her knees buckled and she fell into the snow, her cheek pressed against the frozen ground. A shadow loomed above her. Broad shoulders cut against the swirling white, a figure as solid as the earth itself. She tried to lift her head, but her strength failed. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was a man with hair as white as the storm, his face half hidden in the flurry, his gaze steady, unshaken. Then, darkness took her. When she awoke, warmth pressed against her skin. A fire glowed nearby, painting the cabin walls in amber light, its crackle breaking the heavy silence. Furs were wrapped around her body. The taste of smoke clung to the air, mingling with the faint scent of pine. Evelyn stirred, her body heavy, and winced at the soreness in her hands where frostbite had begun its cruel work. She sat up slowly, her heart hammering as memory returned. The storm, the collapse, the shadow. He sat across the fire, enormous frame bent slightly forward, as though carved from the very logs that formed the walls. His long white hair tumbled past broad shoulders, catching firelight in silver strands. His skin bore the sun-darkened hue of the Apache, lined with age yet strong, with a dignity that had not thinned with time. His eyes, dark as obsidian, studied her with the stillness of a man who had learned that silence could be sharper than speech. He said nothing, and yet his presence filled the room more powerfully than any voice. Evelyn swallowed. Fear stirred in her chest, not of violence, but of what it meant to be under the roof of a man the town named enemy. She had heard the whispers, savage, old, alone. Yet the fire that warmed her now was his, and the furs that shielded her had been laid by his hands. Gratitude and dread tangled inside her. "You carried me," she whispered, her voice rasping, almost embarrassed at its frailty. He inclined his head once. No boast, no explanation. Only truth acknowledged. She looked away, her gaze falling on her torn dress, the edges stiff with snowmelt. She remembered how she had been cast out, how the townsfolk muttered about her beauty, as though it were a crime. She pulled the furs closer around her, not for warmth but for modesty, shame cutting deeper than the storm had. The silence stretched, yet it was not empty. It pressed on her, asking questions without words. She forced herself to meet his gaze again. "Why did you help me?" At last, he spoke. His voice was deep, gravel smoothed by time, carrying the weight of winters endured and battles survived. "Because you were dying." The words landed with the simplicity of a hammer driving a nail. No kindness declared, no motive confessed. Just the plain fact, spoken as if it needed no embellishment. Evelyn lowered her eyes, tears stinging though she willed them back. To be helped without condition was unfamiliar, unbearable. Outside, the storm continued to batter the world, snow rattling against the walls, wind moaning through the chinks of wood. Yet inside, the cabin held a steadiness that defied it. He rose slowly, towering as he crossed to the fire. He added another log, sparks flaring briefly before settling into a stronger flame. His hands, scarred and wide, moved with the certainty of a man who had done this countless times before. Evelyn watched him, seeing not just a rescuer but a fortress of flesh and bone, weathered yet unbroken. She wanted to speak, to fill the silence, but the weight of her own disgrace pressed down. What words could she offer? That she had been unwanted, discarded? That she was ashamed of her own youth and beauty? Her voice caught in her throat. Instead, she clutched the furs and leaned closer to the fire, as if warmth alone could burn away the memory of cold stares and harsher whispers. His eyes lingered on her, unreadable, then shifted back to the flames. He seemed content to wait, as though time itself answered better than speech. Minutes passed in the rhythm of fire crackle and storm howl, until Evelyn's breathing steadied. For the first time in many days, she felt her body loosening its grip on fear. Exhaustion swept over her again, yet she fought it, unwilling to appear weak before this stranger. She raised her head and found his gaze fixed on her once more. The flames threw his features into stark relief. The white mane of hair, the strong nose, the furrowed brow carved deep with years, the jaw set like granite. He was old, yes, but handsome in a way that defied age. Not delicate beauty, but the severe majesty of mountains under snow. She thought of the town's scorn, how they would spit to see her here. Yet in that moment, the thought did not wound her as sharply. The silence broke again, not with comfort but with something heavier, something that dropped into the space between them like a stone into a well. "You need a home." His words were slow, deliberate, resonant. Then, after a pause long enough for the fire to pop and sigh, "And I need a woman." Evelyn's heart jolted. The air seemed to still, though the storm raged beyond the walls. She stared at him, uncertain if she had heard rightly, or if the storm's fury still echoed in her mind. His face did not change, his gaze unwavering. He had spoken not with hunger nor with jest, but with the calm certainty of a man naming what the world itself had already declared. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She felt both terror and something more bewildering. A fragile spark, as though buried deep within her shame, a flicker of worth had been uncovered. The firelight flickered in her eyes as the storm howled its approval outside. The storm did not relent. For 3 days the wind clawed at the cabin, burying the world in white, yet inside, the fire burned steady, and in its glow 2 exiles learned how silence could be shared. Evelyn sat close to the hearth, her fingers stretched toward the warmth, the furs still draped over her shoulders. Her dress had dried, though its fabric hung limp, a reminder of how far she had fallen. She watched the flames with a fixed intensity, as if their restless dance could steady the unrest within her. Across the room, Chenoa worked with the patience of habit. His knife flashed in the firelight, stripping bark from a log before splitting it into smaller kindling. Each motion was efficient, strong, wordless. The cabin was full of such sounds: the scrape of steel, the pop of resin in burning wood, the low hum of wind pressing against the walls. Evelyn realized she had not spoken since the night he had declared those heavy words. "You need a home." "And I need a woman." They lingered in her mind, unsettling her, not for what they threatened but for what they revealed. He had spoken them without hunger, without jest, as if naming a truth as plain as snow itself. She drew the furs closer and said, hesitantly, "Why do you live alone?" Chenoa paused, his knife stilling above the wood. For a long moment he did not answer, and Evelyn thought perhaps he had not heard her, or chose not to. But then, his voice came low, deep as earth. "Because a man who has buried too many does not belong among the living." His words chilled her more than the storm outside. She turned to study him, but he had already bent back to his work, refusing further revelation. She did not ask again. Yet in his silence she glimpsed not only grief but endurance, a kind of strength she had never known in the polished halls of her former life. The days passed in a rhythm that grew strangely tender. He rose at dawn, brushing snow from the doorframe before stepping into the blinding world, returning with logs balanced across his shoulders, or with rabbits caught in snares. Evelyn busied herself inside, though the cabin was small and the chores few, sweeping snowmelt from the floor, mending tears in her dress with coarse thread, stirring the pot of stew he placed before her. Their words were sparse, but his actions spoke with an eloquence she had never been given by her husband's family. He left bread by her side when she napped, set an extra log near her chair when the fire burned low, repaired the sole of her boot without being asked. At first, Evelyn resisted the warmth of these gestures, fearing the price they might demand. But the days pressed on, and no demand came. Only the steady presence of a man who gave without explanation. Slowly, shame began to loosen its grip. On the fourth day, a trader came through the storm, his sled pulled by tired mules. He knocked on the cabin door, shaking snow from his beard as he entered. His eyes fell on Evelyn, then flicked toward Chenoa, and a smirk curved his lips. "So the town was right," he muttered. The widow's found herself in the old Apache's den. Heat rushed to Evelyn's cheeks, sharper than the fire's glow. The trader's words sliced open the wound she had tried to let heal. She lowered her eyes, unable to bear the weight of his smirk. Shame roared back with cruel force. She braced for Chenoa's reply, but he said nothing. Instead, he took the flour sack the trader offered, placed coins in his hand, and guided him out the door with a single, silent gesture. The storm swallowed the trader's laughter as he vanished into the white. Evelyn's throat tightened. "They will never stop," she whispered, trembling. "The gossip, the scorn. To them I will always be cursed." Chenoa met her gaze. His eyes did not soften, but they held a depth she had not yet dared to enter. "The storm howls," he said, "but the fire stays lit." She stared at him, stunned by the simple clarity of his answer. It was no defense against cruelty, no promise of protection, but something more enduring. An insistence that dignity did not need the town's approval to exist. Her lips parted, then closed again. She turned back to the fire, and for the first time in many months, her tears fell not from humiliation, but from the slow thawing of her spirit. That evening, while the storm rattled the shutters, she noticed his coat draped over her chair. It was thick, lined with fur, worn but strong. She touched it hesitantly, bringing it closer around her shoulders. The scent of smoke and pine clung to it, unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to rest within that warmth. Night settled heavily, the wind a constant mournful voice. Evelyn lay near the fire, watching its glow cast shifting shadows along the log walls. Chenoa sat across from her, his figure still, his breathing even. She studied him secretly, tracing the lines of his face, the hair that gleamed like winter light, the scars that crossed his hands. She wondered how many winters he had endured alone, how many storms had raged against this cabin while he sat in silence, waiting for no one to return. A strange ache bloomed in her chest, part sorrow, part gratitude. She thought of the town, of how they had spat her out as if she were unworthy of a place among them. Here, in the cabin of a man the world had named savage, she had been given more care than in all her years of respectability. The thought unsettled her, yet it also steadied her. Perhaps dignity did not come from the approval of others, but from the quiet grace of surviving despite them. As the fire dwindled to embers, she turned her head and found his gaze on her once more. The silence stretched, heavy yet strangely kind. Something flickered in her chest, faint as the last glow of coals, and for a moment she wondered if the storm outside was not the true storm she feared. The wind shrieked through the cracks, and Evelyn clutched the coat tighter. She whispered into the stillness, her voice trembling. "What if I don't belong anywhere?" Chenoa did not answer immediately. He leaned forward, feeding the fire a fresh log. Sparks leapt and the flames surged, filling the room with sudden light. His eyes caught that light as he finally spoke. "Then let this be the place." The words struck her with the force of a promise she had never been offered, and her breath caught in her throat. Outside, the storm pressed hard, but within the cabin, the fire grew, and Evelyn felt, for the first time, that perhaps she had not been cast adrift forever. The storm broke at last. The world lay blanketed in a silence so complete it seemed the earth itself was holding its breath. Drifts of snow shimmered under the weak sun, sculpted into ridges and hollows by the wind's fury. From the doorway of the cabin, Evelyn looked out, her breath clouding in the brittle morning air. Behind her the fire still glowed, but Chenoa was already pulling on his heavy coat, tying it at the waist with a cord of worn leather. "We go," he said simply. His voice, low and certain, carried no argument. She understood what he meant. Supplies. The storm had drained their flour, their salt, their stores of tobacco and oil. They could not stay hidden in their cocoon of firelight forever. Her heart quickened as she wrapped her cloak around her shoulders. The thought of facing the town again, of those eyes, those whispers, struck her like cold sharper than ice. Yet she followed him, her boots crunching into the crust of snow as they descended the ridge. His stride was long, hers hurried, and she kept close to his shadow, as though his breath alone might shield her from what waited. By the time they reached the main street, the town had already begun its murmur. Windows cracked open. Children peered before being tugged back. Women whispered behind gloved hands. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer faltered mid-strike. Evelyn felt the air grow heavy with judgment before a single word was spoken. She walked stiffly, head lowered, yet every step seemed to echo against the boardwalks louder than a gunshot. They entered the general store. The bell above the door chimed, its cheer swallowed instantly by silence. The trader behind the counter froze. His eyes slid to Evelyn, then lingered on Chenoa, and his mouth curved into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Well," he drawled, "ain't that something? The widow Carrington and the old Apache." The words struck her like a slap. Evelyn's cheeks burned. She wanted to shrink, to fold herself into invisibility, but Chenoa's hand brushed her arm lightly, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed, yet its weight steadied her knees. He said nothing, only placed flour and salt on the counter. The trader's smirk deepened, but when Chenoa laid coins down with unhurried calm, the man faltered. His hand twitched, then swept the money away. No more words were spoken. Outside, whispers swelled. Evelyn caught fragments: shameful, savage, young fool, cursed blood. Her pulse pounded in her ears. A boy of 12 spat into the snow as they passed, and a woman clutched her daughter tighter, muttering a prayer. Evelyn felt the sting of tears, not from cruelty alone, but from the memory of once belonging here, of once walking these streets with her head high. Now she was an outcast, a spectacle. The cruelest voice came from across the street. A rancher leaned against a post, hat tipped back, his grin wide and mean. "Tell me, widow," he called, voice carrying over the snow-packed street, "what's it like sharing a bed with a relic of the prairie?" Laughter rippled among the men near him. Evelyn froze, blood flooding her ears, shame burning her skin raw. Chenoa stopped. He turned his head slowly, his gaze locking on the rancher. He did not speak. He did not raise a hand. But the silence that followed pressed heavier than any shout. The laughter faltered. The rancher's smirk twitched, then dimmed, though he forced it back like a man unwilling to admit fear. Chenoa placed his hand firmly on Evelyn's arm and guided her forward. No retaliation, only dignity. When they reached the edge of town, Evelyn's steps faltered. She turned slightly toward him, voice breaking. "How can you bear it?" Chenoa's face remained unreadable. "Words are wind," he said. "The fire does not bow to wind." His simplicity struck her deeper than poetry. Still, tears welled. "But I do bow. Their eyes cut me. Their whispers hollow me out. I cannot carry it." He stopped walking. Snowflakes drifted from the roof of a nearby shed, catching in his white hair. He looked at her not as the town did, not as a curse or a spectacle, but as if he saw her very bones, the shape of her pain. "Then let me carry it." She blinked, unable to answer, her throat tightening until she could not swallow. They walked on. That night, back in the cabin, Evelyn sat by the fire, her face pale in the glow. She turned her locket over in her hands, the broken clasp now mended by his steady fingers days before. The humiliation of the town still clung to her like a second skin, but beneath it pulsed something new, something steady. When he placed a bowl of stew beside her, their fingers brushed. She did not pull away. The hours wore long. Outside, the snow drifted again, quieter now, the world hushed. Evelyn leaned back against the log wall, exhaustion flooding her, but her mind refused to rest. She replayed the rancher's taunts, the trader's sneer, the boy's spit. Yet through it all, another image persisted. The weight of Chenoa's hand on her arm, the calm that silenced a crowd. Her heart twisted. She realized she had wept not for their cruelty alone, but for the glimpse of something stronger than shame, something she had long thought lost. She whispered into the crackling dark, almost to herself, "Maybe here I belong." Across the room, Chenoa stirred, his shadow shifting against the wall. She did not know if he heard, but his head turned slightly, the faintest acknowledgement. Evelyn's cheeks burned with sudden heat, but she did not take the words back. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt her voice had not been stolen by scorn. The fire dimmed to embers, their glow painting her face with quiet light. She lifted her eyes and saw him watching her, his gaze steady, unreadable yet vast, as if he carried a world within. The air between them thickened, fragile and weighty, until her pulse beat loud in her ears. Then came the sound, distant, faint but undeniable. Hooves crunching snow, voices muffled by the cold. Evelyn stiffened, turning toward the door. Chenoa rose without haste, but the flicker in his eyes revealed he had heard too. The town's judgment had not ended with whispers. Something was approaching. The days lengthened as the snow softened, yet the chill lingered in the valley, and with it the rhythm of life inside the cabin. Morning light spilled across the wooden floorboards, catching dust motes that drifted like tiny embers, fragile and slow. Evelyn moved quietly through the space, sweeping ashes from the hearth, folding the furs, mending the frayed hem of her cloak. Each task steadied her, though she felt the weight of eyes from beyond the walls, the town's scorn still pressing on her even here. Chenoa's presence filled the room like weather, constant and shaping. He rose at dawn, shoulders squared against the cold, carrying the axe into the woods, or setting out with bow in hand. He returned with logs stacked high, or a brace of pheasants slung over one shoulder. When he set them down, the cabin seemed smaller for the breadth of him, yet Evelyn no longer shrank in his shadow. She had learned the language of his silence, the way his stillness spoke more than words. When he laid bread beside her cup, she knew it was care. When he placed logs near her chair before night fell, she knew it was thoughtfulness. One evening, as twilight pressed against the windows, Evelyn sat brushing her hair before the fire. Her fingers trembled slightly, more from memory than from cold. She had not allowed another soul to touch her in months, had recoiled from even the idea of closeness. But when Chenoa sat near, his long white hair loose around his shoulders, she found herself lifting the brush and holding it out to him. The gesture startled her more than it could have startled him. For a moment, he did not move. Then, slowly, he took the brush in his scarred hand. The bristles slid through his hair with a sound soft as snowfall, and Evelyn's breath caught as she realized she had offered intimacy, not requested it. She watched the strands gleam in the firelight, silver against the dark. Something inside her eased, a knot loosening after years of tightening. When he finished, he placed the brush back in her hands without a word, but his eyes held hers a heartbeat longer than silence usually allowed. That night she dreamed not of the town's jeers, but of a hearth that never died, of steady hands that asked for nothing and gave everything. The gossip, however, did not sleep. Traders brought whispers that spread like frost on glass. Men muttered that she had been taken. Women hissed that she was a disgrace. Each word weighed on her when she ventured beyond the cabin, when she walked beside him down the rutted street to fetch lamp oil. Stares burned like coals pressed to her skin. Once, a woman spat at her boots, muttering about curses. Evelyn's body stiffened, her breath ragged, but she did not flee. Chenoa's hand brushed her sleeve, barely a touch, but steadying as a pillar. That evening she could not eat. She sat by the fire, her hands clenched. "They will not stop," she whispered, eyes fixed on the flames. "They will always see me as something shameful." Chenoa's gaze held her, unflinching. "Let them see." Her voice broke. "And if I break beneath it?" He leaned forward, adding a log to the fire. Sparks flared, light spilling across his lined face. "Then you rise again. That is how the fire lives." Tears stung her eyes, not from despair but from the unbearable simplicity of his faith. She wanted to tell him how heavy it was, how each whisper cut her open, how she had almost believed the town's judgment herself. But the words caught in her throat, and instead she found her hands sliding across the table, resting lightly atop his. His skin was rough, scarred, warm. He did not move for a long time, but when he did, it was only to let his fingers settle beneath hers, steady as stone. The bloom was not sudden but gradual, like thawing ground releasing the first shoots of green. She began to smile at small things, the way he hummed under his breath while whittling, the way his shoulders carried weight without complaint, the way he listened as if silence itself were an answer. She mended his shirt one afternoon, the needle slipping through coarse fabric. When she handed it back, he looked at the stitching, then at her, and a flicker of warmth lit his eyes. No words passed, but her chest ached with something she had long forgotten: pride in being needed. One night, as snowflakes drifted lightly outside, she took out her locket, the one he had mended. She turned it in her hands, remembering how her husband's family had called her a burden, a curse, unworthy of inheritance. She opened it, revealing the faded sketch inside, and then, slowly, she closed it again, pressing it to her heart. She looked across the fire at Chenoa. His hair shone like frost under the flickering light. He did not ask what she held, nor did she explain. Yet she felt as if he had seen straight through her, past all shame, into the marrow where hope had once lived. Still, the world pressed hard. Rumors thickened, threatening to break into more than whispers. Evelyn heard talk of men planning to rescue her from his cabin, claiming she was trapped, dishonored. Fear coiled in her stomach, but when she looked at Chenoa, calm as a mountain, she found her pulse slowing. For the first time, she wondered if strength could be borrowed from another's steadiness. Late one evening, as supper simmered and the fire cast golden light across the small room, Evelyn reached across the table, laying her hand over his scarred one. Her voice trembled but did not break. "Do you ever regret it? Taking me in?" Chenoa studied her for a long moment. The fire snapped, wind moaned outside, time stretched taut. At last, he shook his head once. No speech, no explanation. Just the certainty of a man who did not barter truth. Her throat tightened, tears burning, but this time she did not hide them. She let them fall, not from shame but from the fragile relief of being enough. The night wore late. They sat together, the silence no longer a void but a presence, thick and tender. Evelyn leaned her head against the wall, the flicker of flames warming her face. She glanced toward him and found his gaze waiting, steady, unflinching, like the earth beneath snow. And in that gaze, she felt a shift so profound it frightened her. She was no longer unwanted. She was no longer the widow cast out. Here, in the company of a man the world scorned, she had been seen, chosen. Yet even as her heart lifted, the sound returned. The crunch of boots on snow, closer than before, many feet moving together. Evelyn's body stiffened. Chenoa rose, his shadow looming against the wall, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward the door. The slow bloom had come alive, but outside, the world was gathering to tear it down. The night was still when the first knock thundered against the cabin door. Evelyn jerked upright, her breath seizing, the sound too deliberate to be the storm or the wind. Another knock followed, heavier, rattling the frame. Chenoa stood already, tall as the logs that made the walls, his hand brushing the doorframe with the calm of a man who had expected this moment. Evelyn's pulse raced. She clutched the edge of her cloak, her eyes searching his face. His gaze was steady, unflinching, though in its depths she read the knowledge that judgment had arrived not as whispers but as force. Voices rose outside. Men, 5 at least, maybe more, their words thick with drink and certainty. "Send her out." One bellowed. "She don't belong in there." Another added, "She's a white woman, not yours to keep." The words dripped with venom. A chorus of gossip turned to mob. Evelyn's skin burned as if their scorn had pressed against her flesh. She wanted to sink into the floor, vanish into the cracks, but Chenoa moved to the door, his steps slow, deliberate. He opened it to the night. Snow swept in, the moonlight catching in the white strands of his hair, until he looked like the storm itself, risen in flesh. Lanterns flickered outside, held by men wrapped in coats, rifles slung across their shoulders. At their head stood the rancher who had mocked her in town, his grin wide, mean, but trembling at the edges as he faced the silent figure in the doorway. "You've had your fun," the rancher sneered. "But she's comin' with us now. Best you step aside, old man." Evelyn's heart pounded, fear clawing her throat. She wanted to cry out, to plead with them to see the truth, but her voice would not form. Chenoa did not answer. He stood tall, arms crossed, his silence heavier than any rifle. The men shifted uneasily. Snow whirled around them, their lanterns flickering as though the storm itself favored him. The ranchers spat into the snow. "You hear me? She don't belong here. You've bewitched her, filled her head with savage lies. This is her last chance." His words lashed across the night, but Evelyn felt a stirring deep within her, fierce and defiant. She thought of the fire, of the coat draped over her shoulders, of the bread left quietly at her side. She thought of the moment he had said, "Then let this be the place." Before she could lose her courage, she stepped forward. The cold bit her skin, the lantern light catching her face as she pulled her cloak tighter. Her voice shook, but she forced it out, every syllable a stone thrown against their scorn. "I stay." The silence that followed was sharper than wind. The rancher's grin faltered. His eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're saying, girl. You're blinded. You'll regret." "I said I stay." Her words cut across him, clearer this time, strong. She lifted her chin, though her knees quivered. "I choose him." The men shifted, uncertain. A murmur rippled, disbelief mixed with unease. Chenoa had not moved, yet his stillness seemed larger now, bolstered by her defiance. The rancher snarled, rage burning through his mockery. He raised his rifle, pointing it toward Chenoa. "Then you'll die with him." The moment cracked open like ice under weight. Evelyn gasped, but before she could cry out, Chenoa stepped forward, into the snow, into the lantern light. He did not draw a weapon, did not raise his hand. He simply walked, each stride slow, steady, unstoppable. His shadow loomed long across the snow. The rancher faltered, his grip trembling though the rifle remained aimed. "Shoot him!" one of the men hissed, but the rancher's finger froze against the trigger. Chenoa's eyes locked on his, dark and endless, and Evelyn realized what she had known all along. His silence was not weakness but the kind of strength that made cowards tremble. The storm howled around them, wind tearing at coats, but no bullet came. The rancher's arms shook, the rifle wavering, until finally he dropped it, the weapon sinking into the snow with a muffled thud. Shame rippled through the men. One by one, their gazes fell, their courage leaking into the drifts at their boots. They had come with fury, with righteousness, but they had no weapon against a dignity that did not bow. Muttering, they turned away, lanterns bobbing as their retreat was swallowed by the storm. Only the rancher lingered, his face twisted with humiliation. He spat again, though his voice shook. "This ain't over, widow. You'll regret this." Then he stumbled after the others, leaving the night to silence once more. Evelyn sagged against the doorframe, her breath trembling, tears freezing on her cheeks. Relief crashed through her, but so too did awe. Chenoa turned back to her, snow catching in his hair, his breath a steady plume in the cold. Their eyes met, and she saw not just the man who had rescued her, but the man who had chosen her without words, who had carried her shame as though it were his own. Her voice broke into a whisper. "Why didn't you fight them?" He stepped closer, his hand rising to rest against her cheek, rough and warm. "Because fire does not fight the storm. It endures." Her tears spilled freely now, but they were not tears of shame. They were the release of years of being told she was unwanted, unworthy. She leaned into his touch, her heart thundering with a new, terrifying certainty. She was no longer alone. Inside, the fire still glowed. They returned to it together, his hand never leaving hers. The cabin was small, the world outside vast and cruel, but within those walls burned something larger than judgment, larger than fear. Evelyn sat beside him, her body trembling with both exhaustion and wonder. She realized the town's whispers no longer held her. Their scorn had not broken her. She turned, her lips parting, but before she could speak, he looked at her with the steadiness of mountains, the warmth of firelight reflected in his dark eyes. In them she saw not pity, not possession, but recognition. And she knew then that the life she thought destroyed had been remade, not in riches or reputation, but in the quiet joining of two outcasts who had found each other in a storm. The wind outside roared one last time before fading, as if bowing to the fire that would not die. Evelyn leaned closer, her hand resting over his heart. She did not need words. Neither did he. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, immense, alive. And as the flames burned steady, the world outside could not touch them.